The Oort Perimeter, Chapter 3. Nordum paced anxiously back and forth across the floor in the reception area as he mumbled incoherently to himself. "Sir, if you don't stop pacing, you'll wear a hole in the deck plating," said his secretary. Nordum stopped and huffed loudly. "It drives me mad when he does things like this. I wish for once he'd just follow my orders without question. No offense, sir, but if he did that all the time, he'd just become another dog on the leash of the society. It's the semi-independence of the military, that the founders created through our Constitution, that allows him to do such a great job of defending Earth," said the secretary. "Without that, who knows what mess we'd be in right now. No offense to you, of course, sir. Yeah, I get that. But I'm still not too keen about him just ignoring me like that. He likely has his reasons, and we'll see what those are soon enough. I also believe we'll find it was worth his small bout of defiance." Nordum grunted. "I hope so." Pendleton carefully edged the ship around the far side of Pluto Station and took up a position behind two other Earthfleet ships docked nearby. "Ship is now in soft dock configuration, sir," said Pendleton. "Admiral, Pluto Station is reporting that you're clear to portal over whenever you're ready," said Martin. Mike stood up and said, "Eric, you have the bridge. Enjoy yourself while I'm gone, and let me know how your tests come out." "Will do, sir," replied Eric. Mike turned to his right and said, "Sarah, would you care to join me on the station?" Sarah smiled and said, "I'd love to." She then looked at Eric and said, "Will you be needing me?" Eric shook his head. "As long as you stay in contact, we'll be all right." Sarah nodded. "I'll be sure that I do." "All right, ship me over," said Mike. A grayish sphere of energy briefly engulfed Mike and then vanished, leaving nothing behind. Moments later, Sarah shimmered and vanished as well. Pendleton soon turned around in his chair and looked at Eric. "All right, so what's first on our test docket? Do I get to show off my most excellent, undeniable Uber piloting skills again?" he asked with an air of mock arrogance. "Actually, no. The first thing we're doing is taking a break. I need to go back to the galley and get myself a double-strength cup of coffee. I haven't slept in 2 days. In the meantime, occupy yourselves playing cards or something." Sydney snickered, causing Pendleton to glare at him. "If you didn't outrank me, sir, I'd tell you to take that little snort of yours and shove it where the sun don't shine," he replied. Martin furrowed her brow and whistled as she turned back towards her console as though trying not to get involved. Eric raised an eyebrow and looked at Sydney, who rolled his eyes and shook his head. Eric smirked. "I guess I'm not the only one who didn't get his beauty sleep," he said. Martin snorted slightly as she tried to contain her laughter. Pendleton glared briefly at her, and then spun around in his seat, crossed his arms, and kicked his feet up onto his flight console. The others soon burst out laughing. Nordum looked up as a portal sphere appeared briefly in front of him, and then vanished, leaving Mike behind. Sarah appeared behind him a moment later. Nordum crossed his arms at this and frowned. "I hope you have a good reason for disobeying my orders, Grand Admiral," he said with a hint of disgust. Mike grinned. "Call it a little political floor buffing. I helped escort the ambassador's ship as a gesture of goodwill. It should, at least, earn us a few political bonus points before we officially start talking to them. That way, if we make fools of ourselves, we won't have to crawl out of quite as deep a hole as we might otherwise." Nordum grinned slyly. "For someone who's not a politician, you certainly think like one," he said. Mike shrugged. "It beats the alternative. The last thing we need right now is to tick off someone else. At least until I can get the rest of the barrier upgraded." Nordum nodded. "Speaking of which, how's that coming along?" he asked. Mike shrugged. "Everything's done except a 200,000 square kilometer area around entry point 27. But we should have enough satellites by the end of the month to finish that area. After that, the barrier should be impregnable. At least, for the near future, anyways. After that, who knows?" Nordum nodded in satisfaction as he pursed his lips and thought. "That's good to hear, It should make it easier for me to sleep at night. Mike smiled. Aye, sir. Well then, shall we go meet the diplomats? I'd like to get this peacocking session over with as soon as possible so I can get back to more important things, like putting Black Orchid in its place. Mike furrowed his brow in interest. Are they at it again? He asked curiously. Nordum sighed and rolled his eyes. When aren't they? You'd think that, after the way we've put down the Illuminati so many times before, they'd be wise enough to know when to mind their own business and stop trying to enslave everyone on Earth. Mike snorted. I'll be dead and gone before that happens. At least at the rate we're going, anyways. Yes, and as soon as we wipe them out, someone else will just start a new group and we'll be back to square one. Mike chuckled. Well, at least it'll keep our lives interesting. Nordum rolled his eyes, and said, at this point in my life, I'd almost enjoy some boredom for a change. Admiral, Chancellor, the ambassador's ship has docked and they are about to disembark, said Sarah. Nordum motioned to the door, and said, well then, shall we? Eric sipped his coffee as he studied his engineering console. As he did, Pendleton turned around in his chair and looked at him. Commander, may I ask you a question? Eric looked up, and asked, sure, what's on your mind? Well, I've been wondering why the Admiral calls you and Commander Jones by your first names, but he addresses myself and Lieutenant Martin by our rank and our last names. Eric furrowed his brow and smiled. That's easy. You and Lieutenant Martin are the newest members of the crew, and still earning your stripes with him, so to speak. The two of us have known the Grand Admiral for quite some time now. I knew him way back when he first took the Sir Genius as his flagship. It was immediately after its Gen 2 refit and, since I both oversaw that refit, and was the most familiar with the ship at the time, as well as all of its most recent upgrades, he made me its chief engineer, a job I've had ever since. So he has a greater familiarity with us than he does with you. That's one reason why he's so free to address us like he does. But in open company, or among other officers, we're usually reduced to being addressed in the same way as anybody else. But on this ship, we're family. So what does it take to become part of this family? Do I have to kiss his feet, feed his pet rabbit and have his first child or something? Asked Pendleton. Sidney chuckled. You could try being on time more often, he said. Pendleton gave him a sarcastic grin. Yeah, well, a lot of that's because I keep having to switch off my communicator to stop certain retards from driving me batty, calling me at all hours of the day and night, and asking me stupid questions. It's enough to drive a man to insanity. Eric laughed. I had a few people like that in my early fleet days as well. I ended up getting them banned from ever using their communicators for anything other than official business. I even got one banned from ever making any outbound calls except in emergencies. You can do that, said Pendleton in surprise. Eric nodded. Certainly. I could do it right now if you'd like. Pendleton snorted with satisfaction. Would you like that list of names now, or shipped to you later in a crate? Eric chuckled. Ship them to me later. If you've got enough names to fill a crate, I'll just let Sarah handle that for me. I heard that, said Sarah over the intercom. Oh, be quiet, bit breath, said Pendleton. Sarah chuckled. So, back to what we were saying. If I'm still earning my stripes with the Admiral, why are you so comfortable calling me by my first name if he isn't? Asked Pendleton. Eric laughed. For the same reasons the Grand Admiral feels comfortable calling us by our first names. He's very familiar with us, and we're very familiar with you. Heck, I've known you since you were in diapers. Your dad and I served together, remember? Pendleton nodded. Yeah, I do. He told me a lot about you. Eric grinned. Nothing bad, I hope, he chuckled. But Pendleton said nothing, choosing instead to merely shrug. Just then Eric's console beeped. He quickly examined it. Oh, this is interesting. Sarah, are all the new modifications online? Some of the modules still aren't responding to diagnostics. All modifications are online. The missing modules are there and pass initial testing. But I haven't been able to develop acceptable diagnostic routines for them yet. Hence why they're absent from your display, came Sarah's voice from the console. I thought those modules came with their own routines. The included routines were inferior and flawed. So I'm creating new ones that will provide the best possible diagnostic information for each module. Eric smirked. You're certainly the perfectionist, aren't you? Pendleton laughed. Isn't that the pot calling the kettle black? He quipped. The others laughed in return. Just trying to keep things up to your standards, sir, replied Sarah. All right, well, get those done as soon as you can. In the meantime, we'll pull out of port and test the systems in a live operational configuration. That should give us some good data to chew on. Lieutenant Martin, would you kindly switch sensors to active mode and begin a wide area sweep? Aye, sir, said Martin as she began her scans. Are we going to be doing all of our tests here, or will we be taking a run around the neighborhood? Asked Pendleton. We'll need to test in a variety of environments, so we'll be taking a tour of the system to get the most complete data set possible. Pendleton smirked. Thought so. Well, if we're going to play tiddlywinks with the local space debris, it probably wouldn't hurt for me to give navigation and helm a good picking through while we're at it. It probably doesn't need any tweaking, but at least I won't die of boredom in the meantime while you're running your tests. How about a game of poker? That would do more to keep our minds occupied than a bunch of boring diagnostics, said Sydney. Pendleton smirked. The way you play? No thanks. I'd be cleaned out before we got to the fourth hand. Sydney grinned, but said nothing. Will you guys be quiet? I'm trying to. Well, hello, said Martin. Eric looked up from his station in interest. Found something? He asked. Yeah, I think so. I've got a sensor shadow at bearing 169.86 at 0.5 light seconds. It's moving away at 0.5 AUH and appears to be accelerating. Does it have an ion trail? Martin shook her head. None that I can find. Any idea what it is? Asked Eric. I'm not sure, but the energy patterns read like a cloaked ship. But if it is, it's not like anything I've ever seen before. Are you sure you're not seeing an error in the sensor data? Just because the fleet signed off on our new gear doesn't mean they won't still have a few bugs in them, said Eric. Martin shook her head. No, sir, it's definitely reading like a cloaked ship. I'm also seeing a tiny trail of high-gain quantum particles and evidence of disturbed gases. So not a typical exhaust trail, but it's definitely vending something. Eric looked at Sydney, who cocked an eyebrow. I recommend we eliminate the possibility of all standard sensor echoes and shadows first. If everything checks out, we may want to investigate it further, said Sydney. Sounds like a plan to me, said Eric. He then opened a communications channel and said, Pluto Station, this is the Sir Genius. We are requesting a confirmation on sensor readings at grid 4 Delta 128796. Can you confirm presence of gas and quantum anomalies in that area? Checking now. One moment, Sir Genius, came the reply. Now we'll see if this is really a ghost, or something more, said Eric quietly. Sir Genius, this is Pluto Station. We're detecting faint traces of gas displacement, but nothing we can identify as anything more than normal spatial drift. What about the quantum anomalies? There was a brief silence before Pluto Station replied. Nah, nothing out of the ordinary. Just normal background noise. Thanks for the confirmation. Can you push us your scans? We're trying to calibrate our new sensors and could use the extra data. Sure thing, Sir Genius. 1 second. A moment later, a block of sensor data appeared on Eric's console. He immediately pushed it over to Martin, who went to work on it. Thanks for the info. We'll take it from here. Sir Genius out, said Eric. He then watched as Martin opened the block of sensor data and studied it, while comparing it with their own sensor data. She then brought it up on 2 separate screens above her console for all to see. This made Eric furrow his brow. He then looked at Sydney, and said, So what do you think about what we're seeing? Pluto Station sees almost the same thing as we do, but in less detail. Certainly not enough to raise any red flags with them. Sydney nodded. While it may turn out to be nothing, I think it would be wise to go down this rabbit trail and see what's there. Worse comes to worse, we discover it's nothing and simply go back to what we were doing, he said. Eric nodded. Agreed. Joel, set course for Earth, 20 AUH. Sydney, when he begins his acceleration arc, cloak the ship and switch all weapon systems to standby. Joel, when I give the order, change course for the anomaly and go silent. Martin, hail Pluto Station and tell them we're leaving dock and heading in system for some diagnostic drills. All three crewmen acknowledged their orders. What do you want us to do? Asked Barker. Nothing for the moment. But stay sharp. If this is what I think it is, things could get interesting in a few moments. Sydney looked at Eric curiously. Do you think it's something hostile that slipped in when the Syrians arrived? Eric frowned. I don't know, but I'm not about to take a chance on it. Aye, sir. The Sir Genius soon turned away from Pluto Station as intended, and began accelerating towards Earth as it shimmered and vanished behind its cloaking shield. It then made a sharp turn and headed straight for the anomaly. All right, Joel, let's close the distance on that thing as quickly as possible. Use FTL if you have to, said Eric. Won't FTL break our silent running? Asked Pendleton. Eric grinned. I've already solved that problem. We can now fly silent without being detected, even with the FTL running full. Pendleton grinned, and said, nice. Eric chuckled. Yeah, I thought so too. Hey, when you close on the target, make sure to stay at least 2,000 kilometers behind it at all times. Be its shadow. That should reduce our chances of being spotted if it's actually a ship, said Eric. Aye, sir. Mike patted down his uniform as he picked at its edges. Nervous, Admiral? Asked Nordum. Mike looked at him in curiosity. Me? Nervous? What makes you say that? He asked. Nordum grinned. You're preening yourself like a monkey. Mike smirked. It's that obvious, is it? Nordum nodded. It's almost as if you're anxious about meeting our guests. Mike laughed. Only as nervous as I have to be. I'm not one to take first contact lightly. First impressions are always the most important. Nordum squinted curiously. This is hardly first contact. We've been in talks with the Syrians for months now. Yes, over subspace, but never in person. This is the first time we get to see them face to face. And, given their bat-like appearance, I want to ensure that they're happy, lest one of them try to use me as a portable drink dispenser. Nordum laughed. You're worried that they'll drink your blood like some big furry version of Dracula? The thought had occurred to me, sir, replied Mike. Nordum grinned. I can understand where you may have gained such an apprehension. The Syrians are a somewhat terrifying race to look upon. Mike smirked. 5-foot-tall wingless vampire bats would be an ample description of them. It's something that would give my grandchildren nightmares for the rest of their lives. Well, if I had any, he quipped. Nordum nodded. Mine as well. 2 loud chimes then sounded, followed moments later by 3 columns of energy that appeared briefly, and then vanished, leaving behind 3 ornately dressed bat-like creatures. Across their eyes were large, darkened goggles meant to protect their eyes amidst the brilliant light of Pluto Station, and other non-Syrian locations, as most Syrian homes and ships were typically kept dark and lightless to protect their highly sensitive eyes. A few moments later another group of energy columns appeared briefly and then vanished, leaving behind a cadre of Aldovian servants. They too wore goggles like the Syrians did. However, theirs appeared to be designed for light amplification, as their eyes were not as sensitive to light. Thus, without them, they would have difficulty seeing within the darkened interiors of the Syrian ships. Realizing that they no longer needed the visual assistance these offered, the servants took them off, squinted briefly, and then tucked them into small bags that hung from their waists. Mike and Nordum watched this with interest before looking at each other. Let the games begin, said Mike quietly. Nordum strode forward, and said, Greetings, I'm Chancellor Nordum, leader of the Brayburn Society. Most simply know us as the Society. He then motioned to Mike, and said, "And this is Grand Admiral Clayton. He's in charge of our military defense forces." He eventually held out his hand, and said, "It's nice to finally meet you in person." But the three Syrians didn't respond as he'd expected. They looked curiously at him for a moment, and then talked quietly between themselves in clicks and chitters for over a minute. Finally, one of them stepped cautiously forward, sniffed his hand, and then retreated back to the other two. "Can you say, awkward?" whispered Mike. Seeing this, Sarah stepped forward, grabbed one of the Syrians by the shoulders, touched her forehead to his, and clicked twice. She then returned to Mike's side as the Syrian looked at her in curiosity before smiling a gangrenous, toothy grin. "Were neither of you briefed on proper protocol when greeting a Syrian delegate?" she whispered to the two men. Mike cocked his head slightly, and said, "Apparently not." One of the Syrians stepped forward, bowed, and said, "I am Searder of the Nest of Noidok. I greet you on behalf of our people. I am honored to be here. But I am curious why we were properly greeted by one of your females, and not yourselves." Mike bowed apologetically. "I'm sorry for the seeming lack of courtesy, but it appears that we weren't informed of the proper method by which to welcome you." "Yes, I can see that. But why was this female the one who knew, and you did not? It would seem that you, as the male of your species, should be better informed. This isn't actually a human female you're seeing. This is Sarah, the core AI from my flagship, the Sir Genius. As an AI, she tends to know more than we do." Searder cocked his head curiously as his large, bat-like ears flicked back and forth as though hunting for the sound of prey. He soon grinned again, almost deviously. "A ship's AI? How curious. But if it's truly an AI, why did it choose such a form?" he asked, gesturing as though her presence was suspicious. "When a ship's AI first becomes sentient, they are allowed to choose the name, gender and appearance they will use as part of their human interface system. This hologram, or avatar as some would call it, is just part of that system." Searder nodded in approval. "Very interesting. I find it intriguing that your AI would choose a female form over a male, as the male form is superior. Then again, we should not find it surprising, as you quite often bestow the female gender on many things that do not have gender." Mike shrugged. "Well, it's human nature to give gender to many things, including ships. You could say it's an ancient habit that's hard to break." Searder nodded and smiled. "I can understand that sentiment. Traditions tend to take unusual forms within a culture, and are often the hardest to change. Even ones that are foolish and obsolete." Mike cocked an eyebrow at this, but said nothing. "Chancellor, Admiral, if it is not too much to ask, we would like to take a tour of your facility in order to better understand your people," said one of the Syrians. Mike glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly that everything was all right. He then glanced briefly at Nordum, who also quietly acknowledged this. He then looked at the Syrians, and said, "Well then, let us begin our tour."